You are listening to the Apex Hour hosted by Ryan Paul on KSUU Thunder 91.1. This show allows more personal time with our guests, allowing them to give us their stories and opinions. We will also give you new music to listen to, hoping you enjoy some new sounds and genres. Welcome to this episode of the Apex Hour.
Welcome to the Apex Radio Hour. I'm producer Faith Christensen. I'm here with Apex Director and Professor of History Ryan Paul and our special guest, Dr. Lisa Diamond. I'm turning it over to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Faith. We are so happy to have Dr. Lisa Diamond, who I will tell you is a rock star in certain parts of this campus. We've been doing this a long time, and it's like we've got people following and signing autographs, and so thank you for bringing some class to this joint.
I have never been accused of bringing class anywhere I go, so I'm pretty happy
to hear that. So what I'd like to start with is kind of a how we get to now question. So first of all, let's talk about what you're doing now and then how you decided to do that.
Wow. So what I'm doing now, like the sort of thing that's driving my life and my work, is really trying to both understand and affect the lives of LGBTQ Utahns and their families right here in Utah. I have a whole career studying sexual and gender identities, studying the long-term health effects of close relationships and also stigma. And being a psychologist, we're usually working with big national data sets. And over the years, I think we've realized that a lot of the experience of stigma and marginalization, whether it's due to race, class, ethnicity, sexuality, those experiences are really, really local. And when we talk about the effects of stigma on this population or that, we're usually speaking in really general terms. And I'm not from Utah. I moved here in 1999. And I've observed so many unique things about the Utah experience and Utah families. And so now I really feel kind of passionate. And we have so much expertise in Utah. There's a lot of folks at universities all across the state where there's a lot of really amazing stuff happening. And I think it's time, especially in this historical moment, for us to turn our attention to caring for one another and for focusing on the things about the Utah queer experience and trans experience that are distinct and that call for a different approach, and just what can we do to understand and intervene in a beneficial way.
I mean, I think there's something important to recognize the fact that we are not, as a state, as monolithic as some people think we are.
That is so true. And certainly the impression I had of Utah when I moved here was like I didn't really know anything about it. And that's probably true for almost every state, that there are things about it that other people don't understand. And I think in this current kind of socio-political climate, it makes it even more important to understand, well, what's the lived experience on the ground in different parts of this state? And one of the things we're trying to do and build momentum for is to do a longitudinal cohort study, to actually start collecting data that we hope will go on for many years from LGBTQ Utahns and their family members, to try to understand how families adapt to adversity over time and how their own understanding of what it means to be LGBTQ in a place like Utah, how that changes and evolves over time, and to see if we can, track some useful information for schools, for clinicians, for policymakers on what works and what doesn't when you have families that are adjusting to an earthquake in their own family, an earthquake that will affect very many other family members. And, the advice that we often give is really general, like love and accept, and all that is great, and it's all true. Yes, we should love and accept. But there are there are on the ground practical issues with how do you help a family navigate through, one or more children having an identity that some members of the family see no pathway to embracing, and how do we provide some sort of meaningful guidance to schools who have those kids in their classrooms and to parents who show up at PTA meetings. How do we provide families with information that's a little more useful and applicable than just love and accept your kid. Like, yes, love and accept your kid. And that's not going to be enough. Like, hard stuff is still coming.
Yeah, it's interesting that you use the word earthquake, because we often associate these kinds of things with physical trauma or physical reactions, or, you know, we know what an earthquake is, we know getting shot or whatever, but based upon what you've been talking about earlier today is that the brain doesn't recognize those oftentimes. The body may, but the brain doesn't recognize those as separate.
That's so true. And I think this is something that really has changed in the field of psychology. Historically, we did not appreciate social threat for the influential experience that it is. We think about threats as physical threats. And just think of the messages we give kids. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you. Like, never was there a greater lie in the history of the world, because most individuals that are truly broken are broken because of a rupture in their social relationships to others. And so, yeah, sticks and stones, you know, will bruise you. They will not break you the way that rejection and exclusion and isolation will. So right from the beginning, we give kids messages that are actually pretty invalidating. And we say, just, you know, buck up. It doesn't matter if everybody, you know, hates you, if you love yourself. All of that is just kind of crazy. And part of what is helpful about where the field is going is that now that we understand more about the neurobiology of how the brain handles social threats and the ways in which our brain doesn't distinguish between social pain and physical pain. Naomi Eisenberger has done some amazing studies of that. I think we're finally getting to the point where we can appreciate that rejection and exclusion from your community is a physical threat. It's a biological event in your brain and your body. It's not just an idea or an emotion or an attitude. It's in your body.
You know, it's interesting to me that as I think about my own experiences, that oftentimes the hardest thing to heal from are the words. It's not the sticks and stones. And I remember very distinctly, to my great shame, that the time that I learned that words could hurt people more than physical violence and cause more lasting damage. And I think that people who recognize that and use it as a weapon are really the truly challenging ones. I remember, you know, Calvin Coolidge, they used to call him Silent Cal because he wouldn't talk a lot like the previous president would. And he would say, well, I'm the president of the United States and what I say matters. And I should be very deliberate in that communication. And I think if we all took that advice about how really devastating these words can be, I think things might be a little bit different. So the other question I have is, you're a psychology professor at the University of Utah. Is this what little Dr. Lisa Diamond wanted to do as a kid?
I don't totally remember what I thought I would be as a kid. I know I was always a writer. And so early on, I think for a while I thought I would be like a poet. And my father was like, no, you're going to be like me. You're going to be a scientist. And I'm like, Dad, you don't understand me. And, you know, it's kind of he did end up, correct. But I also think that it's because I was drawn to literature and poetry. I was interested in emotions. I that was always what fascinated me. And so I think that I still bring a little bit of that artistic kind of sensibility to my writing and my work. I'm a very human, it's like I'm obsessed with humans. I think humans are just crazily interesting. And so that, I think, to some degree carried through. But I never thought I would be I didn't even know what, psychology was. In high school, I didn't even take the AP psychology classes. I just had no appreciation for it at all.
So when then you went to school I realized there are many different fields and disciplines within psychology. What led you to do what you do now?
It was very accidental. I initially thought I might go into anthropology because I was fascinated with these questions of how much of your human experience is human nature and how much is culture. And so the whole distinction between essentialism and social constructionism and what are you born with and what does your culture give you? I found that like just fascinating from the very beginning. And eventually I was going to be an anthropology major, and then I switched because my best friend was majoring in anthropology, and I didn't think it'd be good for our friendship. So I switched to psychology. And the psychology department at the University of Chicago, which is where I went to college, was not that great at the time. It was a lot of like older, boring folks doing experiments that were not very interesting to me. And when I decided to apply to graduate school, I was basically applying to do something that didn't really exist yet. I wanted to study lesbian and gay. That's what they were at that time. There was no B or T or Q. It was lesbian and gay youth. And there had just started to be a literature on lesbian and gay teenagers. There was like a few articles that were published, and I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. You know, I wonder what's going on with those folks. And I was also noticing that there were no women in any of the studies that were being published. There were these really small studies, like 20 kids at a gay support group. And so I decided, I want to study the like social development of lesbian and gay youth and just how it develops. Well, that just wasn't a thing you could really do at that time. It wasn't a field. There were people doing that work, but they were only a few of them scattered throughout the country. And none of them had any graduate students because it wasn't something that people did in graduate school. And so I applied to Cornell to work with Rich Seven Williams. He had written this, book called Lesbian and Gay Youth. And when I applied to work with him, it turned out that he had been considering retiring early because once he started doing gay-related work, graduate students stopped applying to work with him. And he was like, wow, I guess this is just going to be the way it is. And he was just going to become a clinical psychologist. And then I applied to work with him. And so then he ended up staying for the rest of his career and actually doing research again. So I like to take credit for his later life career. But it was a hard thing to do in the early 90s. There wasn't a track to do it. So I had no idea what I was doing. I was just kind of going from decision to decision kind of randomly, and luckily it worked out.
It's interesting that because it hadn't been that long. We talk about the lavender scare in my history classes that the APA had ruled that lesbian and gay, that it was a mental disorder, mm-hmm. right? And it was in the 60s or 70s when they reversed that?
It was 73, I believe, when they took it out. And at the same time that they took it out as a disorder, they added gender identity disorder of childhood. So it's like, yeah, we'll give you queerness, but, that gender nonconformity, that's just not, acceptable. But, yeah, I mean, the field of psychology has had a tortured relationship with almost all forms of marginalization because, like any other academic discipline, academia has a certain amount of privilege baked into it. And so, of course, the field of psychology just reproduced a lot of the problems that the rest of the culture showed, and not just with regard to gender and sexuality, but with regard to race and class and all those things. So it's been an evolution, and a lot of people are like, how can you, psychology is such a, it's a history of sort of epistemic violence against marginalized groups. That's absolutely true, but so does every other discipline, and so does every other profession. So at some point, you have to just decide you're going to try to, push things to what degree you can. But yeah, there's a history of exclusion in almost every major academic discipline.
That's fascinating. So I do want to take our first break now, if that's okay. I think this is a good spot. And as those of you who've listened to the show before know that we ask our guests to send in some of the songs that they've resonated with or that mean something to you so we can play them. And I was so happy to see this person on your list because I love Rufus Wainwright.
Oh.
I mean, I think his his new about could lead a band, all this other stuff. I mean, but his stuff is super
He's
cool.
amazing.
So
and he's unappreciated. And when I heard it playing in the hall, earlier today, I was like, Rufus,
yes,
my man.
I do love me some Rufus Wainwright. So the song you gave us was "Going to a Town." So can you tell us why you chose this song?
It's funny. When I was road tripping with my 2 graduate students who road trip with me, here today, and so we were playing music, and I'm like, I've got to introduce them to music that they will not hear, elsewhere, and I picked this song to add to our playlist. And and it's interesting because this song, I remember listening to it. It's called "Going to a Town," and it came out in the George W. Bush years, back when that seemed like a threatening time for, sexually diverse and gender diverse, individuals. And that time seems like heaven compared to what we are going through now. And I remember that once Obama was elected, I remember thinking, oh, wow, like I don't feel a need to listen to that song anymore because now I feel like things are better. Like we left that dark period, because that song is really about being disappointed in your own country for just betraying you. And I was like, oh, it's all better now. Boy, was that wrong. And I remember after Trump got elected, I'm like, now I'm going to start listening to that song again. And now I feel it even more deeply. So for me, that song is, a very kind of heartfelt experience of, like I believe in the principles of America. Why does it keep letting us down so profoundly?
So one of the things that you've talked about, I want to talk about evolution of the brain a little bit. So a phrase that you have used often in your presentation and conversation is the ancestral condition. Mm-hmm. So can you, I think I know what that means, but can you explain this? Because everything that we are now, I'm not talking like by 2 legs and all that kind of stuff and fire, but everything that we think we are, really comes from responses that have evolved from that space. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we, humans evolved during the Pleistocene era. And so our brain was shaped by hunter-gatherers who were basically moving around the earth in small groups, hunting and gathering food, group living in small communities, where childcare was shared. There was alloparenting. In other words, people had babies and you mainly cared for your own baby, but then while you were gathering stuff, you handed off your baby to other folks and they took care of your baby. So we evolved in conditions where there was not only no kind of, industry or technology, but in which the conditions of basic life were unpredictable, they were harsh, and you depended fundamentally on other people in your group. There are lots of primate species that are kind of very individualistic. So chimpanzees, for example, are actually, they live in groups, but they're very individualistic. Humans are not. Humans are, among the most social of primates. And so a part of the ancestral context was constant fear and constant hunger and need. And all of those things, the problems created by constant fear and hunger and need and danger, the solution was always other people, was the people around you protecting you. And we don't really have an appreciation for that in our modern context, and especially in America, where we are so obsessed with the individual. We reify individuals. We're like, it's about you and yourself and you. And it's sort of antithetical to the way our brains work. There are whole sections of our brains that are just devoted to recognizing faces and interpreting facial expressions. Everything about our brain has been shaped by our social nature. And so we have to interpret our modern problems through the lens of understanding what our brains evolved to do back during the Pleistocene era, because that's when all of these circuits were designed. We are still walking around with the brains that we got back then, and there's a huge mismatch between our modern environment and what those kind of brains want and do, we see evidence of that in a whole bunch of ways. I mean, some have argued that a big part of the obesity epidemic is that our brains evolved to notice when you started eating something that was very highly caloric dense, sweet, salty, fatty, because in a low resource environment, when you find nuts, you better want to eat them. You better want to eat the high calorie dense foods because they were hard to come by. So now we have a whole brain that's evolved to experience fat and sugar as like highly pleasurable. That served us really great in the ancestral context because those things weren't around that often. So when you found them, you ate them. Now they're driving us crazy. Now our evolved preference for highly dense food is giving us diabetes. And so there's a whole bunch of things where our modern context is mismatched with what our brains evolved for.
So in some ways, we have been evolved to seek groups of people simply to keep us safe.
Exactly.
We find safety in the group, which I guess can be good and bad, right? I mean, you see fascist Germany, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's this collection of identifying with this group, and or in other places where it's actually turned out to be very positive. So
I think the example of fascism is a really great one because, early on after World War II, and people would say, how is it possible that other people in Germany kind of went along with this, and why didn't everybody realize, what was going on? And often when people would interview, and especially during the Nuremberg trials, when they would interview members of Hitler's regime, they were focused on their local context. I had to follow the orders of my group. In our group, we saw things like everyone, that groupthink is a real thing. And it was in George Orwell's novel, 1984, groupthink. The reason groupthink is a thing, the reason it holds us so powerfully in its grip is because everything in our brain evolved to say, prioritize that. Don't prioritize your individual impulse that says, I don't know, I don't want to do that. Look at what the group is doing and focus on what the group wants of you. And that is and so it's a great recipe for fascism, because if you have a charismatic leader who can kind of wield that groupthink in a certain direction, then it can be a very, very powerful force. And I think that is a big part of what we see in our contemporary context.
So if that then is the case, then it is exceedingly almost the definition of tragedy when the group that you have come to seek out for safety and protection turns away from you.
And that's why it's often called sanctuary trauma. That when the group that is supposed to actually be the last resort, the primary protector, shuts its doors psychologically to you, it's a deeper cut. It's a deeper wound. And it's why family rejection has a stronger effect on kids than, say, peer rejection or other forms of rejection. The closer a group is to your sense of selfhood, then the more being pushed out of that group will hurt you and will wound you.
So to what extent I realize this is a generalization, but to what extent do we as individuals then define our individuality by the sense of what our chosen group is?
We do it every day. I mean, and I think adolescence is a great kind of period of life to look at this, because adolescence is really when the social brain comes online. And so the period of development between, say, post-pubertal to age 18 is when all of a sudden adolescents are obsessed with what other people think about them, with modeling their behavior. It's often when you see adolescent friends start to dress like each other, and parents will say, well, why can't they be individuals? Because for a social brain, they learn how to be individuals first by being a part of a group. and adopting bits of that. And it's literally, you're watching their neural circuits kind of develop. And so during those years, you do sort of borrow your individuality from the group. It often isn't until early adulthood that, young adults start to be able to distinguish between what my group wants and what I want, because over-identification with the group is actually kind of a necessary part of that brain development.
But, doesn't one of the fundamental rules of society is the idea that at some point, the thing that separates us in many cases from some of the animals is that we have the ability to put our own needs and our desires behind ourselves for the good of the community, for the good of the group. In fact, that's almost expected in some ways, that we need to suppress in some cases, because at the same time, it's not like we don't want everybody just doing whatever they want all the time, right?
There is no society that doesn't have rules and laws about how you behave in groups and what is the role of individuals versus the group. And different cultures do it in different ways. So, for example, in Japan, the expectations for sacrifice of your individual needs for the needs of your family, that is a much stronger part of just the ethic of family life than it is in America. And just look at the fact that in America, a lot of folks will say, I'm not going to have my elderly parents live with me. That would really interfere with my life and my family. A choice like that would be unthinkable in other cultures. And so every culture has to figure out what they think the right rules are for what you give for the sake of the group and what you keep for yourself. And one of the things that's been really kind of complicated about America in particular and just Western individualism is that we kind of invested pretty heavily in individual, at the expense of all else. Just you do you. And it is part of the reason why we don't have universal health care, and it's part of the reason why we don't have a social safety net the way that other European countries do. And at the same time, some would say, well, that's also the engine for creativity and ingenuity and blah, blah, blah. So this toggle between you as an individual and the needs of your group, that's the most fundamental basic problem that there is. And every culture solves it in a different way. But unfortunately, no matter what trade-off you choose, there are some very old, evolved programs in your brain that are going to be throwing off, kind of side effects of whatever trade-off you make.
As we're talking, I am reminded of, admittedly, I'm a bit of a comic book nerd. There's are you familiar with The Flash? The hero, The Flash? He runs real fast.
Yes. I think I saw it
so
once,
there's
but I'm not a Marvel person.
There's a story from the 60s where this guy develops this ray that if he shoots you with it, you disappear. And the reason you disappear is because people forget you. And the idea is that as he shoots the Flash and he says, this works because as our identity is tied into how many people think about us, when people stop thinking about us, we physically disappear.
Yeah.
So he shoots the Flash with it and he's disappearing, and some girl whose kitten the hero saved in the very first of the comic book is holding her kitten and says, didn't some guy in red help me? And then the Flash comes back.
Wow.
But it's such way back in the 60s, this idea that who we are is often dependent upon. They don't see me.
Yeah.
Right?
And the fact that it's a human need to be seen by another person. Like, it's not enough to just be with other people. You have to be you have to feel that they are looking at you, that they are seeing you. And a great example of this in terms of sort of brain development is there's an experimental paradigm called the still face paradigm that's often used with infants that really shows the way that our brains are sort of wired for that responsiveness. Most caregivers, when they're interacting with a baby, without even intending to, they're looking at the baby, they're responding to the baby's cues, they're just sort of like going in the moment. And so in the still face paradigm, you bring in like a caregiver and a baby and you let them play, and then you instruct the caregiver to just stop responding, to just keep a neutral expression on their face, not a mean expression, just neutral, and to not change it. And within about 30 seconds, the child is in a full-blown panic response because babies' brains are literally wiring around the responsiveness of another human that's looking at them, responding to them, having a sort of parallel emotional response. It is what we need. When infants don't get it, they cry. When adults don't get it, we feel anxious if we feel unseen and we feel unacknowledged. And so this issue of responsiveness, of not just being with another person, but having them actually see your humanness and see it as sort of parallel to their own, is a fundamental human need.
Wow, that's super. I want to get back to that. Let's take our second break, though. This is a song called "Us Against the World" by Jungle. What is your? Give us your.
This is a band I discovered on TikTok, and they're this fantastic band. And they for their most recent album, they hired like a choreographer and a group of dancers, and they did an entire sort of like visual kind of choreographed thing. And so I was binge watching all of their videos, and this is the first one in that kind of series. And the video series, you can find it on YouTube. It's called Volcano. So just YouTube Jungle Volcano. And I just love the rhythm of it. And Us Against the World kind of feels like, I said to my students, I'm like, this is our lab theme song. You know, we're just kind of trying to make things a little bit better. And I love the sort of upbeat kind of vibe of it.
We're here with Dr. Lisa Diamond, a psychology professor at the University of Utah. And we've been talking a little bit about the group, right, and how evolutionary wired it is into our brain to be part of that for a variety of reasons. So it seems to me then, and you and I have talked about this a little bit briefly earlier today, is that that's the great catch-22 of humanity, right, is that we seek the group, but then the group then disappoints us or whatever, and then it leads us back into the cycle of seeking another group that will validate us. Mm-hmm. And then eventually, of course, that group generally we become so it's like this kind of like, how do we need to break that cycle, or where do we get out of this?
There's no need to break the cycle. It's an eternal cycle, and it will never end. And I think it's like a glitch of the brain, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it is a catch-22, and I think one way that becomes really evident is that humans, because of our big brains, we're the most sexually diverse species on the planet. We have a broader range of sexual relationships and practices than any other species, partly because as our brains got bigger, we started to use sex for social functions and not just reproductive functions. So we have evolved to be a species of variation that shows variation. And yet, we're so social and so group focused that the moment someone looks at our form of sexual variation and says, that's weird, we lose our minds, right? So we're the most shame sensitive because of our social nature. There's nothing worse than doing or being something that the group doesn't want. But we're also predisposed to have variation, to be a diverse species. And so that is something that I think you see kind of running through our entire society, that we make a lot of rules and a lot of judgments about sexual variation. Over the course of history, people have attributed it to sin, to illness, to criminality. Our species is always trying to understand, what is it that makes someone do something different that other people don't like? And I think a more interesting question is just like, how then do you cope with the fact that everything in our brains promotes diversity, and yet everything in our social nature says, until it gets you in trouble with the group, then you can't have that. Then you can't do that. And if you do it anyway, then that brings some consequences in terms of rejection and hypervigilance that can really trip you up.
So we really have to learn how to survive the choices of other people, mm-hmm. in some ways. So how do we then decide what, and this is not, I mean, I asking this question is troubling, but I mean, I don't know how to say it without saying it, but how do we decide, like, social deviant behavior, like serial killers or whatever? How do we decide that type of individuality
I think most people would say it comes down to harm of other individuals. And so that's why, people will, when they talk about sexual behavior, they'll also be like, between consenting adults. So we have a basic assumption that variation is great, but come on, we have to have, some standards. And if you look at most cultures and most legal systems, they consider force and harm to be the dividing lines. Making other individuals do things, most cultures view that as bad, although obviously forcing women to have sex, has been a constant throughout the entire kind of world. So force and harm are usually where most cultures will draw some sort of line. And certainly historically, for a while, folks decided that anything that was not reproductive was just sexually wrong. And that was kind of ironic because the defining feature of humans is our capacity for non-reproductive sexuality. Human females have a menstrual cycle. Which means that and our menstrual cycle does not preclude sex outside of the periods of fertility. There are lots of mammalian species where sex only happens when the female is ovulating. That's not true for humans. Humans have sex all the time. And in fact, there's a lot of sort of biological research that suggests that the only way that an ovulating, a sort of menstrual cycle female makes sense is if there's enough sex happening in the species to kind of guarantee that pregnancy will occur regularly, often enough. So having non-reproductive sexual behavior that has no chance in resulting in conception, is about the most human trait that there is. And so that's what makes it so ironic that so many communities are like, well, anything that doesn't produce a baby, that is unnatural and wrong and to be resisted. But if you really think about it from a species level, that is what it means to be human.
And I think I read something about Pope Francis talking about that most recently, right? About how the Catholic Church's version of intimacy needs to evolve or change a little bit. So
the Catholic Church is not big on evolution and change, and good luck with that. That's kind of my response to that. I was like, that's a great message. I'd love to see where that goes because so far, we haven't had a lot of luck.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting then as we talk about how we've moved that way over time and decide what behaviors are, the force. According to what we've talked about earlier, then it would seem to me that we need to rethink some of that as well, because the most lasting and challenging harm in some cases could not be a parent that actually physically abuses a child, but a parent that constantly threatens that or says those things can be equally as damaging.
There are studies now that show that emotional and verbal threats of love withdrawal, if you do that, you're not going to have a family anymore. Those have the same effects on mental and physical health as physical violence. So emotional abuse is abuse. Emotional neglect is neglect. Because we're a social species, if you do not provide the nurturant connection that the human brain evolved to expect, then you have an environment of danger from the brain's perspective, and it's going to adapt in some way to that. And I think historically, we've had trouble validating forms of childhood maltreatment that aren't physical. I remember reading a book by Ingrid Clayton, and the book is called Believing Me, and she's a therapist, and she grew up being sort of psychologically abused by her stepfather, who started, he confessed that he was in love with her. He took her to Las Vegas, and he never physically touched her, but he kind of groomed her psychologically, turned her mother against her, and she, at some point, even had someone from her school. She told a counselor, and they had someone from Department of Children and Family Services come and visit the home, but there was no observable harm. the fact that he was kind of psychologically manipulating and coercing her and telling her that he was in love with her. None of that was enough to activate, anything in the system. And so her book is really about how she became a trauma therapist, and also how she, for many years herself, had trouble believing herself that what was happening, that it was harmful, that our society's preference for focusing on physical harm and ignoring emotional harm is so invalidating and does a sort of second form of damage by allowing individuals to be like, well, maybe I'm the one that's crazy. Maybe I shouldn't be this upset. So what's wrong with me? And we really need to understand the degree to which social relationships are such an important part of our physical health that when something in our primary relationships is wrong, it is like something in your body. It is affecting the way your mind and body functions, and can have way longer lasting effects than a physical injury.
So evolutionarily, what are the things then that we need to unravel? I mean, obviously, evolution is the idea of progression, right? Mm-hmm. And take building on what came before. So if we were wired this way in the ancestral condition, what are some of those things that we were wired with that maybe now we really need to think and figure out how to untangle?
I think the most important message for people to take away from that is that every single dysfunctional habit that you have related to, say, maltreatment or rejection or something, every weird thing you do, every weird brain tick or hypervigilance or a startle response, or the fact that you don't like intimacy or you can't get enough intimacy or whatever it is, if that is happening in your brain, that means that at some point in our species, that particular adaptation to a social environment that wasn't meeting your needs, that particular adaptation worked. That, if you think about some of the sort of longest standing acknowledged sort of traits that humans have that are shaped by early environment, which is attachment styles, that some kids are really secure, some kids are more anxious and they need a lot of reassurance, and some kids are more avoidant and they really don't want any comfort. And early on, those styles used to be thought of as like, oh, everybody wants to be secure. And then if you're anxious, you're avoidant, those are like deficits. And then there was, a shift that really occurred, I think around the 90s, where people really started to realize, no, those are adaptations. If you are growing up with a caregiver that withholds affection, then becoming avoidant is a fantastic adaptation. Because all evolution cares about is getting you through your childhood, just surviving your childhood. And so we often carry those adaptations forward, but most of the things that we dislike about ourselves are adaptations that simply are now mismatched to our current environment. And so some sort of trauma-informed therapists will talk about the fact that we all have an adapted child in our brain. That's the child that did what it could do to get whatever they needed to get in their caregiving environment. And maybe you were in a hostile caregiving environment and you had to protect and defend yourself. And maybe you had a great environment and you didn't. And then as we become adults, then you can look at your impulses and question them and make different choices. But your adapted child, the part of you that, for example, maybe panics every time a relationship partner says, I want to talk to you about something. And maybe you're the kind of person that growing up, that meant you were in trouble and you have a panic response. The reason you have that inconvenient panic response is because it worked, because it was there to save you. And so all the things we hate about ourselves are all adaptations. And we have to sort of treasure what they did for us as children and what they did for the human species and be like, okay, you don't work now, but of course you're there. You saved my life. And so an appreciation for the fact that humans are always adapting. It's just that those adaptations are sometimes rough, sloppy, they're based in childhood, they're not reasonable, but they exist because they helped us. And as far as evolution is, natural selection is like, hey, if you're alive, then I did my job. don't be mad at me because you have panic attacks all the time. Those panic attacks saved you. They got your attention. They made sure that you would know when you were in danger. So I think it promotes a little bit of like self-forgiveness and self-compassion, that everything that we hate about ourselves must have served us in some way if it's still with us.
Wow. Outstanding. Thank you very much. I think this is also a time for us to take another break. If that's okay. This is we're here with Fleetwood Mac, who I love, and a song called The Chain. You want to give us a quick...
Oh, I love The Chain. The Chain is the only Fleetwood Mac song that all 5 members of the band had a writing credit on. And it's like one of their greatest hits. And the thing that's really funny about it is when they were writing Rumors, they had space for another song. And they're like, yeah, we need another song. Go and write one. And they basically sent them off for 2 days to just come up with something. And what they all ended up doing was taking little bits that they had not used. Stevie had some lyrics, and Lindsay had some stuff, and John McVie had that amazing bass line. And they just sort of kind of cobbled them all together until they had something that worked. And what I think is beautiful about that is that the final result is nothing like what the individual parts were on their own, but it's a beautiful creation of a team. And it really shows, and I'm like, I always joke to people that my lab is basically like a band. Everyone plays a different instrument and everyone is contributing something different to the work, and it becomes something different in collaboration. It becomes a piece of music that is unrecognizable from the little bits and pieces, but it's something of its own.
So let's talk about our final segment, the joy question. So here we go. Lisa Diamond, what are you currently watching, reading, listening to, or playing that is bringing you joy?
I have been rewatching the HBO series Succession, which, if you haven't seen it and you're interested in families and trauma, there is nothing better. It's like a Shakespearean kind of drama, and I'm enjoying it the second time because the family dynamics between the characters, it is so, it's just everything about that social brain, that these full-grown adults, when they're under stress, are behaving like children and cannot resist their kind of baby brains. And the actors are so fantastic, and the writing is so fantastic that it's just like the human condition writ large.
Nice. HBO, right? Mm-hmm. So we're also joined with Dr. Diamond's graduate students, Jay Christensen and Julia Decker. So we're going to ask them as well. Jay Christensen, what are you currently watching, reading, listening to, or playing that is bringing you joy?
So I am currently I just started listening to a podcast called The Magnus Archives. It's a sort of a horror podcast, cosmic horror heavy, but it's presented in this audio archive format. And as I said, I just started. I'm still on season 1, so I haven't gotten very far into it. But I, as a lover of cosmic horror without the xenophobia, it's amazing, and I love it so much, and I go to sleep listening to it most nights.
Wow, good for you. All right, Julia Decker, what are you currently watching, reading, listening to, or playing that is bringing you joy?
Okay, so I recently started listening more to a band called Big, which is headed up by Adrienne Lenker, and her writing style is just so absolutely gorgeous to me. Like, she does a lot of really fun wordplay and like alliteration and metaphorical stuff, and I heard the song Vampire Empire on TikTok, and then I got like really into it. So I'm just like obsessed with her writing style. I'm going to see her solo perform in the summer, but I'm like, oh, I want to be able to write like that. And
what song should we start with if we've never listened to them? Should we start with Vampire Empire?
Vampire Empire is good. I really like Not, and I like Simulation Swarm, which is a couple years old.
Nice. Well, thank you. Faith Christensen, what are you currently watching, reading, listening to, or playing that is bringing you joy?
So the other day, my husband and I, Chase Christensen, because there's 2 Christensens here, so just was fine. We went rock climbing, and it's kind of funny. But when I first got into rock climbing, I used to just like, all right, focus on the route. Here we go. Up we go. And now more anxious thoughts come to mind of like, your life is being held by a rope. I'm like, disregard that. I'm so sorry, microphone. Okay, disregard that. But it's been really also interesting as being the belayer underneath, watching my husband go up, and he doesn't have as much anxiety as I do with going up now. And it's just a comforting thought of like, I am also holding my husband with a rope. But it's the beyond thing that I think about. Like, I'm so thankful that I was trained on how to do these things, and that I and my husband can do these recreational activities together for fun. So that's what was really fun recently. But Ryan Paul, what are you currently watching, reading, listening to, or playing that is bringing you joy?
Picard Season 3. Oh. So I'm late to that party, but I'm glad all the seasons are done. So it's Picard Season 3 on is what I'm really enjoying currently right now. Not as much of a Star Trek, I'm not deep into the stuff, but it's part of my youth, and it's nice to see all of the old gang back together again to tell a really cool, fun story. So with that, we'd like to thank everyone listening to the Apex Radio Hour. We're going to go out with the final song by Billie Eilish, Getting Older. Do you want to say anything here, Dr. Diamond?
Well, I am getting older. And so, when I first heard this song, I was like, yeah, Billie, you're not even old. I'm like, you're in your 20s. I'm like, I'm 52. But what I love about this song is, there's a line where she says, things I once enjoyed just keep me employed now. And I think my kind of mission throughout my whole life, because I chose to do work on a topic that's personally meaningful, I think if you make that choice, you have to really be careful and really be aware of when to step back so that you do not drain it of joy and you don't drain it of its meaning. And I think I've succeeded in doing that, but partly that's been because I choose enough things to work on that I kind of give certain parts of my brain a rest from certain topics for a while. And so I think it's a helpful message for young people to think about that, yeah, you want to do what you love, but you don't want to do it in a way that drains all the love out of it and makes it a grind.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you, Dr. Diamond. Thank you to Jay and Julia and Faith and all those who partake in the Apex Radio Hour.